Open the pod bay doors, Tom.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away.
46, 56 degrees.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really exciting to be here before this amazing movie and also to share with you just a little bit of the work that I do and some of the things that I care about. So, Black Narcissus, for those of you who have not already seen it, is a movie about a group of nuns who travel to open a new convent, hospital, and school in a Himalayan palace, which is inexplicably built at the top of a very large cliff, and some of the challenges that they face while they are there. And so some of those things include sort of a disorienting location and environment. They are essentially trying to multitask. They're overwhelmed by all of the people in the town who need health care, who are trying to enter the school that they're running. But at the same time, they're very isolated, and so they start to experience a lot of loneliness. They're lucky enough to have a resident sexist hanging out with them. And they start to, kind of wonder if maybe they would like to return to their former lives. They start to become suspicious of each other, and eventually we reach kind of full mental decline. And so, as I'm sure many people in here know, when you've got to multitask, when you've got stressors coming in, both psychologically and environmentally, that can take a real toll on your mental health. And we don't even have to look to the past to really understand this. Even today, the coronavirus is having a specific toll on women's health, which is, I assume, why I was invited to speak before this movie, which is about women's health, mental health. And so, especially in light of the coronavirus, we're seeing that this is impacting women more than men as far as the stressors that they encounter. And there was a paper that came out just last month that essentially quantified what I think a lot of people know that they are experiencing. Here's just a little data for you. So the top graphs are showing prevalence of major depressive disorder. The bottom graphs are showing anxiety disorders. And if you start with the blue lines between women and men, you can see that even before the pandemic, women were already experiencing higher levels of major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders compared to men. But what happened with the pandemic is it amplified those gender and sex differences and so if you look at the orange lines now, that's sort of how much extra depression and anxiety there is today compared to a couple of years ago. And you can see that those changes are much bigger for women than they are for men. And so understanding the role that sex and gender play in the development of mental health issues is really, really important for both clinicians and basic scientists alike. And so it's not just these two, major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders, that have disparities among men and women. If you look at a number of mental illnesses, you can see that they occur at some greater degree in women compared to men, and some at a greater degree in men compared to women. And what you notice if you look at the disorders that occur more frequently in women, these include post-traumatic stress disorder, panic disorder, anxiety disorders, and major depressive disorders we've already seen. All of these disorders have that element of stress to them. And so specifically what I'm interested in my lab is understanding sex differences and how stress affects the brain. But interestingly, when I started becoming a neuroscientist, when I started my graduate training, that wasn't something that a lot of people were interested in studying. And in fact, most labs that use rats and mice, like my lab, were only using male animals to study to study the effects of stress. And this has been going on for a century. So showing you a little more data here. So on your y-axis, this is just the percentage of all publications. So if you read the methods section of any research paper and look at whether they used male or female animals. At the beginning of the 20th century, most papers just didn't even bother saying what the sex of the animals was. A couple of them, you can see down the bottom, they said, okay, we're using male animals, we're using female animals, or they happened to be using both sexes. That was pretty rare. But you can see that the vast majority here, can we see my, oh yeah, vast majority just didn't specify. Then something happened in the late 60s, early 70s, and I don't actually know what caused this switch, where suddenly more papers started to report the sex of the animals that they used, and you can see that by and large, that unspecified got replaced with all males. And so what you can probably infer from this graph is that they were always using males all along. They just didn't bother to say because it was almost such a given. Like, of course, we're studying male animals in order to understand, basic science and true things about the brain. And so you might ask yourself, well, why wouldn't we be using females? And the answer may not surprise you at all. It is, of course, crazy hormones. So these graphs here are showing the sort of peaks and troughs of ovarian hormones across both the rodent estrous cycle and the human menstrual cycle. And you can see that generally speaking, they're very similar. There is sort of a brief period of time characterized by high levels of hormones, whereas the rest of the times things are pretty flat. And so the general consensus here among scientists was, well, that's too hard. The data, if I'm collecting data from female animals and some days their hormones are up and some days they're down, data is going to be really messy and I won't be able to understand anything about the brain. So I'm just going to use males because their data are going to be cleaner. And so that just became kind of the dogma forever, and people just use males. Even when you were studying something that, when you translate up to humans, happens more frequently in women, they still only use male animals to study those neural processes. And so I started thinking about this sort of idea, this mentality that the data are going to be messy, reminded me of some other mentalities that we may have seen in, in society. And so this is a really old meme, but I think everyone here probably gets the point, which is, it's a joke that women are complicated and men are very simple. And that is something that I think kind of pervades a lot of what we think about when we talk about men and women in general. And this, of course, is something that translates, across all fields, right? This isn't just scientists, this is everything. And so in trying to put these things together, I started to think, where did this idea even come from, right? We know that, men have emotions too, and hormones and all these kinds of things. So where did this idea come from, that women are complicated, men are simple? And if you read back into some of the sort of history of science / gender studies literature, you will find that it actually came from Victorian era biologists. Around the time of sort of pre-turn of the 20th century, the prevailing sort of biologist narrative about the difference between men and women was that women were essentially an inferior version of men. And that was sort of how things were being put out into the world by scientists. And at a certain point, that became a little un-PC even for the Victorian era. And so the biologists said, okay, we need to come up with a new narrative here that doesn't say that women are inferior, just essentially that they're different. And so the new line became women have different characteristics that are biologically determined, and those include things like sensitivity, emotionality, instability, kind of this messy yin to the men's logical, stable yang. And so by doing that, they were able to say, okay, see, women, like, you have your own thing, but clearly with these unique traits that you possess, you are not fit for leadership in society, and thereby the patriarchy was preserved. And this narrative really stuck, as we all know, because it's still around. And it's my sort of theory that is how that these same mentalities about the way we perceive men and women differently in society has infiltrated the way that scientists perceive male and female animals, and their utility in terms of understanding fundamental things about biology. And it made so much sense, just sort of intuitively, that nobody even stopped to ask the question empirically until the 2010s, when a couple of research groups did meta-analyses, meaning they went back through lots and lots of thousands, hundreds and thousands of research papers to actually ask the question, is the data that we collect from female animals actually more variable, right? Is it messier than the data that we collect from male animals? And it turns out that the answer is no, they are exactly the same. So there is no difference in the variability of the data that you collect, and this is true for both rats and mice. And so these papers came out, and now female mice are liberated for inclusion in neuroscience research studies. Everybody's very excited, people were like, well, I still just want to study male animals. But it turns out, believe it or not, that males have hormones too, and they also vary, and they can vary according to social dominance. So in a neuroscience laboratory, you've got your cages of mice, and you put maybe 4 or 5 mice in a cage together. They're going to establish a dominance hierarchy, and the dominant male could have as much as 10 times as much testosterone as the subordinate males in the cage, and testosterone is a really powerful neuromodulator, and it could definitely be affecting their data, but nobody really considered that to be like a problem for neuroscience research. So there's clearly been a double standard for decades, and we are working to try and get that not to be the case. And what I want to show you is a little bit of some of the work that we're doing in my own lab that really asks the question, so when you exclude female animals from research, what are you missing in terms of trying to understand brain and behavior? If we're looking for sort of behavioral outcomes that map onto something that we're interested in at the human level, are we even looking for the right thing if we're only looking at males? And so in my lab, we study fear. We're really interested in post-traumatic stress disorder, and we're interested in understanding the situations that lead to what we would say sort of abnormal or heightened fear responses in males and females. And I'm going to show you a little video that shows what we normally look for in males. So this male has been trained to be afraid of an auditory tone, and so you can't hear it, but the words there are showing you that it's on, and you can see this male heard the tone. He's going to run into the corner and freeze. And so this freezing response is what has historically been looked at as the one indicator that an animal is afraid. And so you basically just count the amount of time that the animal spends freezing, and whatever else the animal might be doing just kind of gets thrown out. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like when a female hears that same tone. So here she is, she's exploring her environment, and the tone's going to come on in a second. There it goes. So you can see she spins around, runs to the other side, does some quick kind of vigilance behavior. She engages in a little bit of freezing right here. But as you can see, she is soon going to kind of come out of that freezing posture, do a little bit more looking around, like she's sort of creeping out to see if it's safe to come out. So there's a lot more going on there. And so this can start, this is gonna go on a loop. So as you can see, if we had only counted just the amount of time each of those animals spent freezing, we would have concluded that the female was not afraid and the male was afraid. But looking at those videos, you can see that everything that female did was a response to the tone itself. So she clearly knows something is not right. And so what we're doing now in the lab is looking for the neural circuits that drive those different kinds of responses in our male and female animals. And so this video that you're seeing here is something we've collected really recently. There's a new technique that basically allows you to see through a chunk of brain, and all these fluorescent glowing neurons here are connected to an area of the brain called the ventral periaqueductal gray, which we know controls freezing. And so what we think is happening is that this circuit is really strong in males and maybe less strong in females, allowing some of those other behaviors to emerge. And so that's what we are looking at here. These neurons have been labeled with a fluorescent dye so that we can see it, and then we can use these really cool tools to map this all out. But you're basically taking a deep dive inside a rat brain right now. So why is all of this so important? Of course, it's because ultimately what we want to do as neuroscientists is develop drugs to help people who have some of these disorders that are caused by extreme stress. And most of the drugs that are on the market today that are given to everyone were developed using only male animals. And so if we're not even looking for the right kinds of behavioral changes because we don't know, because we're only looking at, say freezing, we might be missing out on drugs that could specifically help women. And so this is one of the key questions that we're trying to answer in my lab and hopefully, in other people's labs as well. Along those lines, we do have some promising news, which is that in 2016, the National Institute of Health, which funds lots and lots and lots of research all over the US, mandated that everyone, all the scientists who are applying for grants from the NIH, have to use male and female animals in their research now. And so what we've seen over the last 5 years is a big increase in the number of people who are adhering to this mandate, who are starting to study sex differences in their lab for the very first time, and who have identified sex-specific genes, neural circuits like I'm doing, and behaviors that relate to mental health. And this is where all of the kind of inspiration for drug development is going to come from. And so I think we're really going to learn a lot and hopefully be able to improve mental health for everybody in the coming years. So that is all I have. This is my little group. We just celebrated our 10th anniversary. And so thank you so much. I hope that was informative and useful, and enjoy the movie.